Hello, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to the Czech EU presidency event that is part of the EUROMOD project here at CERGE-EI. My name is Klára Kalíšková. I'm a researcher at the think tank IDEA here at CERGE-EI. I'm also an assistant professor at the Faculty of Informatics and Statistics at Prague University of Economics and Business, and I'm a member of the Czech national team for EUROMOD. The title of today's panel is For Even Better Public Administration, EUROMOD Promoting Evidence-Based Policymaking in the EU. So the keyword here for today's event really is evidence-based policies. Evidence-based policies have three indispensable ingredients: data, research, and policymaking that takes evidence from the two former. So today I will start by telling you a little bit about the EUROMOD model. EUROMOD model is a very interesting tool. It is an EU-wide project that describes the tax and benefit systems in EU member states, but also other countries. And since the audience here today is very heterogeneous and not everyone is very familiar with EUROMOD, I will first address our first panelist, Salvador Barrios. Salvador is a head of the Fiscal Policy Analysis Unit at the Joint Research Center at the European Commission. And this unit has basically, or oversees, the maintenance and development of the EUROMOD project. So could you please, Barrios, start with telling us a little bit about what is the EUROMOD project and especially how can it help in enhancing this evidence-based policymaking? Thank you.
Thanks, Clara. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation, prestigious panel. EUROMOD is a very concrete thing. In the end, it's really dealing with a very concrete aspect of day-to-day life of people. So how much tax you pay if you earn a certain level of income, how much social benefits, and so on. And this determines many important aspects of life. So it's a very concrete thing. In the end, it's not such a sophisticated model. It's really a tax benefit calculator. But what does it mean is that being developed by researchers and being developed the way it was developed, which is essentially a tool which allows you to compare best practices across European countries, it can be incorporated into deeper analysis, dealing with many different socioeconomic aspects. So essentially, it's a tax benefit calculator. Imagine the complexity of this model. I mean, you have to deal with 27, well, formerly 28, now 27 is a bit simpler, sadly, tax and social benefit system, and this involves country-specific knowledge. But at the same time, a new perspective on things in terms of where do we want to go together in the EU, in terms of social policy in particular, but also in terms of tax incentive for employment, to fight against discrimination, gender imbalance, and so on. So it's a very concrete thing. In the end, it's not rocket science, but it's so complex because the tax and social benefits system are so complex that it requires specialized knowledge. So maybe before continuing with the beauty of EUROMOD, if I may say, let me explain who we are as well, because I think this is something we need to explain to the public, to explain what is the role of the Commission vis-à-vis the JRC. Well, first the Commission, and here I have Loukas, who knows a lot about that, working in DG Employment. The Commission has been supporting EUROMOD from the very beginning through research projects, and then directly through direct financing by the policy DGs in Brussels. And there was a clear interest for developing the model because the EU and the crisis in particular we have witnesses over the past years, the financial crisis, the COVID crisis, the refugee crisis, and now the energy crisis, gave a clear EU dimension to many social economic issues in Europe. So we are the JRC are the research service of the Commission. We support the policy proposal by the Commission and the policy recommendation made by the Commission. When the Commission makes a policy proposal or recommendation, we always need to identify the best policies. And there are two clear criteria for that. One which correspond also to the mandate of the Commission. One is to ensure that these reforms are based on sound fiscal programs, so they are sustainable fiscally. And the second is the redistributive aspect. And the second has gained a lot of importance over the past years. And this is something that now is systematically done within the Commission, thanks to our role and thanks to the development of EUROMOD over the past year. This is something which is systematically assessed when a proposal is made by the Commission on many different aspects, and I think Loukas will talk about that. So we at the JRC, as the research service of the Commission, we need to provide science-based advice, and we need to provide policy options. And for all those policy options, we need to make clear what are the consequences on the fiscal side and on the redistributive side. And I think this is something which is really paving the way for, let's say, a more transparent dialogue with the member state in particular. EUROMOD is also that. It brings a type of platform for the policy dialogue with the member state. And that's something we are very keen to work on, making the model open, freely available, which is what we managed to do over the last year. And the model is, above all, transparent. So this is what EUROMOD is. This is our role in terms of the model development, and that's something we are fully engaged to continue over the forthcoming years, in particular thanks to the joint work with the national teams. We are the Commission, we are an administration, we have a clear mandate, but we need the independent advice and contribution from academia. And this is something which makes the model, like other models, it's not unique in that respect. There are other models with the same philosophy, and that's what the JRC promotes, is really to be transparent and to build on sound state-of-the-art science. And this is what we do with the EUROMOD national team. And this is something which is essential to guarantee the credibility of the model, both on the policy and the scientific side. In a nutshell. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Maybe we have time for a very quick question from the audience, if someone wants to ask something, Barrios. Or maybe we will leave the questions for later. I have just a quick follow-up question, if I may. Could you give us an example of when the EUROMOD was used in some policy-making process, or whether people actually use it when they do, I don't know, regulatory impact assessment in their countries, or is it being more used for these EU-wide policies? Just give us some examples.
Well, there are many examples, because we work on a daily basis with concrete reform proposal. I mean, just thinking about, for instance, the recent proposal of minimum income, which is an essential aspect that the EU tries to promote through the social pillar. This is something we have evaluated with EUROMOD. And what we can do with EUROMOD is precisely to identify best practices across European countries and possibly giving signals and, let's say, identifying the way forward for those countries lagging behind. And this is to the direct benefit of the people in these countries. So it's a very concrete contribution, and we provide the figure behind that in a very objective way. So that's a concrete EU example. Another example, since you want two, comes to my mind the key role EUROMOD has played in the context of the stabilization program of Greece. There we had provided technical assistance. The countries was in huge difficulty. Reform were much needed. You had the institution in this country debating and kind of trying to reform the countries in order to get back on a sustainable fiscal path, but also the social consideration was key in that respect. And that's what EUROMOD could bring in this context. So we had provided technical assistance to Greece. We continue collaborating with the Greek authorities, and it had very concrete consequences on the design of specific reform. So EUROMOD, again, is really something that brings clear and very concrete answer to day-to-day life issues that people may face.
Thank you very much. So I would like to move to a second panelist. Our next panelist is an economic labor economist, but also Deputy Minister for Science, Research and Innovation of the Czech Republic. Štěpán Jurajda has a very unique experience as both academic researcher who published in top international journals. He also has experience from many national and international advisory bodies, and quite recently also, as a Deputy Minister for Research and Development. Štěpán, could you give us, or how do you see the interdependence of the research, data, and policy making, and maybe give us some examples where do you think in the Czech Republic we can do better?
Well, thank you for the honor of the invitation. It was already mentioned that when referring to the role that their institutions play in evidence-based policymaking, I have two homes to refer to. So I'll put on two hats. First, I'll make some negative remarks from the perspective of a labor economist, and then I'll put on the hat of the deputy minister and make some positive remarks. And my remarks, of course, will be centered on the Czech Republic. I guess that's my role on the panel. You're in a workplace that's involved in EUROMOD and micro-BRD, with the OECD and SHARA and several pan-European projects that do provide important, micro data-based evidence for policymaking. But let me mention how the Czech Republic deals with three specific issues that I happen to consider to be important for the future of not just our economy, but perhaps even our democracy. So we went through a major health crisis, right? The COVID pandemic. Our excess death rates were roughly twice that which they probably should have been, given the quality and size of our healthcare sector and the resources there. Who collected the key data on contacts between individuals and types of households that fed all of the key epidemiological models that governed the policy response? Well, it was a private, tiny research outfit with, funding from banks, etc., and from research projects. It was certainly not any systematic data collection effort on part of the healthcare administration or the public administration in general. After this, largest health crisis since World War II, how did we use resources from the RRF facility? Well, 9/10 of the research money went into purely clinical research, metabolic complex, cardiovascular, oncological diseases, neurodegenerative diseases. I happened to be, at the time, a member of the R&D and I Council, which is an advisory board to the government. So we managed to get 1/10 of the research funding from the RF directed at systematic health crises. And because that project spans 10 different subfields from, law and governing during crises all the way to, poverty or demographics, we're talking about 4 or 5 FTE appointments per one of these fields for the next couple of years. Why is that important? Because this country is an example of what I think is relatively typical for what used to be the new member states, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria, in that social sciences are relatively underdeveloped. And the Czech Republic, if you look at the share of social sciences on the total pie of support, it is severely underfunded, in particular relative to natural sciences, not again in terms of the absolute level, but as the share of the total pie. If you look at any international data on output of different fields of science, social sciences are lagging way behind. you will find next to nothing in many very important fields in terms of internationally recognized research output. Why is that important? Because in my view, it is hard to get high relevance, quality, empirical applied research that guides government policies if you don't have the methodological top of the pyramid where people get their doctoral degrees and then end up working in various applied research institutions, be it in academia or as part of the government. And most importantly, while we have, for example, 4,000 biologists in the Czech Republic who annually publish above the median article influence score in their field, so therefore they're very solid, highly productive biologists. I have so far been able to find 4 people in the country who have a PhD from a school of public health, the way it is defined, in London or New York or anywhere else. So how can we have a policy response on public health? Be it, response to a pandemic, or be it response to the massive aging that's just around the corner. So the quality of healthcare provision will be one of the key pillars of just keeping, not just the fiscal policy under control, but just how people feel about their government being able to provide what it always has been able to provide. If we don't have any research on health economics, health communication, preventive behavior, etc., literally almost nobody. And since academia in general, it tends to support the parts of academia inside labor managed firms that already are there, that are already of high quality. For example, we have fantastic chemistry, fantastic biochem fields, and so on, really on world-class level very often. I think this is, one example. My other example is pension reform. I happen to be on the expert team advising the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs with the current version of the pension reform. There are several people in the room who have participated on previous national pension committees. Do we have microdata-based evaluations of how labor supply responds to changing contributions or taxes across part-time employment, self-employment, how different age groups or cohorts respond to different incentives? Is that part of the evidence that is discussed at the meetings of this committee? Certainly not, and it has not been the case for almost decades. What about? By the way, the head of the IAB, the German Federal Research Institute, is a well-known labor economist with an H index of 50. A country from the set that I tend to refer to as what used to be the new member states. If you have a head of a research institute of that type who used to work as a quality assurance person in a minor league IT company with no research experience in the field, right? So my third example, perhaps even more important, has to do with infodemics. There are several countries, for example, Slovakia, our neighbor, that have, and the Czech Republic too, that have serious issues with common sense of reality, sharing common facts. That also has to do with health behavior and health communication, of course. Again, if it wasn't for this tiny little portion of 1/10 of the RRF facility, would we have any directed support to at least start some research on infodemics in this country, which again is a combination of social sciences and media studies and so on. So if we don't have capacity to conduct research in critical, typically social science fields, how can we expect policy-based, evidence-based policymaking to make major headways? I think in general you have to simply, provide a large set of studies to be convincing. You have to, look at different issues from different angles to really convince the policymakers. So to conclude the first negative set of comments, I think what's missing is a bit of meta-research on evidence-based policymaking across European studies. There are TSI projects on supporting evidence-based policymaking here and there, but do we have actual data on how much data is used of different type? How frequently does it make to elaboration, being elaborated, ending up on the desk of governments when they're making decisions? And I think it's not realistic to expect member states to do this on their own, because it's very difficult to start new fields from scratch, such as public health. Now, putting on the other hat of a deputy minister, the current government, is finally starting first steps of a legislative process that might lead to a new act on public data, on how we use public data that's already being collected, how it could potentially in the future be merged across information systems, anonymized and used for research, which is something that's incredibly difficult at the moment, almost impossible. And there's very few incentives for anybody in the policy game to change that. So hopefully this government will provide such revolutionary change. I'm hopeful. And my minister, Langšádlová of Science, Research and Innovation, certainly very supportive of this. There's other initiatives like the European Health Data Space, etc. But I think that making a breakthrough on access to public data would be great. And we have started preparing some technical support instrument projects where we're hoping to get pilot evaluations of R&D funding programs in companies that would spearhead the ability of the Czech administration to actually provide evaluations of how R&D funding is used. So that will be one example of evidence-based policymaking that we would again be starting almost from scratch, and I'm hopeful that our minister and the R&D Council will be able to deliver on these promises in the next 2 or 3 years.
Thank you very much. Is there any quick question, Štěpán? Okay, so I actually leave my question for later. There are so many of them. But Štěpán mentioned many things that are important for good evidence-based policymaking, and the very first probably is really the data. So let me go back to the data issue. Let me go back to our next panelist, Anna Clemenceau, who works in Eurostat, where she heads a unit responsible for statistics on income, living condition, and quality of life. This unit is basically responsible for providing statistical data to all member states on these topics, and also providing data for the EUROMOD project. So could you please tell us a little bit about how Eurostat plays its part in this effort to enhance evidence policy making, and probably tell us a little bit more about how you cooperate with EUROMOD, and any prepared presentation that I will just put on.
Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure for me to be there with you. So I am working in the statistical office of the Commission, and in my short presentation, I just would like to explain to you how we work, and especially what is our role in EUROMOD. So I don't need to tell you anymore about EUROMOD, because all the other speakers will speak how important it is. And there on the slides I've put a lot of uses, especially in reports or publications produced by the Commission. But I think EUROMOD would not exist without some input data. And the input data is produced by Eurostat in coordination with all the countries. So the input data is called EU-SILC, EU Statistics on Income and Living Condition. This is the EU instrument for measuring poverty and social exclusion in the EU. So it's, as I said, it's implemented jointly with all the national statistical institutes of the European Union, because the data are collected in all countries. Currently, it's implemented even beyond the EU countries, because it's collected in 36 countries. So the data are collected at national level, but they are transmitted to Eurostat. And they are transmitted to Eurostat in the form of microdata. So this survey was launched in 2003, so it's nearly 20 years that it exists. It's a multi-purpose survey. It's focused on income and poverty, but it covers in general living condition, housing, health, education, and all demographic characteristics of the population. What is interesting, it's also that it's a panel survey, meaning people are interviewed for 4 or 6 consecutive years. So we can see whether someone who was in the low part of income distribution, whether the same people is moving or not, or whether some people get in and out of poverty. So this is of interest of this. What I would like to explain is, okay, this data it's collected, it's a sample. It's sample, so around the EU we have 400,000 households which are interviews every year. What is our role there is that we need to be sure of the quality and especially of the comparability of the data. Because what is important for EUROMOD is to be sure that the data we produce are comparable. And to do that, I think we have a strong instrument, which is EU law. So we have a statistical law on this project, and this defines all the basic characteristics of the survey, all the definitions. We need to be sure that the income definition which is used by all countries in the survey is the same. We need to be sure that exactly the same information is transmitted to us. When we speak about housing, we need to be sure that it's exactly the same definition of all the variables. We have also some technical requirements in terms of sampling and in terms of questionnaire and so on. So this is our strength that, in fact, we have this law defined at EU level, then the data are collected at national level, and they are transmitted to us in the form of microdata, and then they are validated at national level, but revalidated by us at EU level, and then we produce the EU aggregates, we disseminate all data country on the EU aggregate. But like that, we guarantee a level of comparability of the data, and I think this is important then for all key indicators produced, because it is not only used for EUROMOD, but it is also used for key indicators produced and used at policy at EU policy level. For example, the key indicator, what we call the ROP indicator, at risk of poverty and social exclusion, is extracted from these data sources. So this is one aspect we do with this. So not only data comparability is important, but timeliness is important. If you ask the policymakers, they want the data yesterday. So this is it. So, but this is also one issue which is in our regulation. We put the deadline for transmission of the data to us, and then we should, as quickly as possible, behind that. This is something we take into account. We just have developed and agreed with the member states on a new regulation. And on the slides, I highlight that we have pushed in terms of timeliness. Before, until the end of 2020, we were getting the data between 1st October and 23rd November of the year after the data collection. With this new regulation from 2021, we go for a transmission by December of the same year, or final data at the end of February of the following year. So we push for timeliness because we know it's a key element for policy users to do that, but without sacrificing on quality. So this is why we always have a trade-off between the two, but this is important. Then the last point I would like to highlight, and it's finished, is that we need to have data as policy relevant and as much data as possible. So I have taken 3 examples, but we now with this this new regulation I just explained that we developed, we get now on income, we get at the same time gross on net income. It was a choice before. We go also into, on benefits, we get into a lot of details on, for example, whether it's contributory or not, means tested or not, on things like that, on a lot of metadata information. And we adapt all the time. We get a lot of background information because it's very important to look at poverty for migrant, non-migrant people, or for disabled, non-disabled. It's a big issue at this stage. So we get a lot of information. We have also, in this period of COVID, added some specific variables on COVID. So we try to adjust this instrument working together with the countries, but with a strong coordination from Eurostat. So this is how we work on this and trying to fulfill the policy requirement as much as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And so I think we will get back to the data issues later on during the discussion, but let me now follow up on the thing that Štěpán Jurajda told us, that the EU member states cannot do that on their own. So this kind of brings me to our next two speakers. So first I would like to introduce Christoph Schwierz, who is head of the Revenue Administration and Public Financial Management Unit at the DG Reform of the European Commission. So let me follow up on that and ask you to tell us a little bit more about what you at the DG Reform do to provide assistance or encourage member states in evidence-based policy making. Thank you.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thanks a lot, Clara. And to resonate immediately with what Štěpán has basically said here, I mean, the challenges are enormous. So starting basically from 2015, when DG Reform and predecessor was founded, because we saw there is a need to support member states with technical support for reforms, we have undertaken more than 1,400 projects. I find this already quite a large number, but it still does not show what the real number of need is behind. The demand for our services have been fourfold, and only this is a part of the picture. So basically, you know, in all of these projects, you can think that evidence is a part of those projects, if not in all, but in most. The challenge is huge. The competition for resources is huge. Voila. So just as a starting point, it's not an easy equation to solve. And of course, we live in the policy times to solve very complex problems. So in DG Reform, we work in all kinds of reforms related to energy sustainability, migration, sustainable finances, R&D, and other aspects. And we see, of course, that policymakers have little time, but a high need of reliable, timely, effective information to help them solve the problems. So I see, you know, a growing need of evidence basically for policy making. This is where we are trying to help. The COVID-19 pandemic was a nice example. Nice, I mean, not meaning that it was easy or it worked well, but suddenly everyone became interested in policy evidence also. Yeah? I mean, when you entered a taxi, everyone had an opinion on epidemiological responses and the effects on the economy. I think this is, you know, a very actually interesting entry point, that evidence, there is a need and a desire for evidence in the larger society, not only in the policy making. And that has also shown that evidence can enhance the trust in government, in policy making, increase the level of compliance of policymakers, and also enhance the legitimacy of policy making. But the full potential of science and policy, not yet there. And surprisingly, maybe, I mean, surprisingly for me, I have to say, we see that international indicators show that not much progress have been made overall in using tools like ex post evaluations. One would have expected that actually we have made progress overall, and our own country analysis shows that there is still a lot of gaps between policy making and using scientific evidence and research in decision making. So voila. How does DG Reform help here? several entry points here, one more horizontal, the other more concrete. In general, we bring technical expertise by using own commission expertise such as JRC ones, international organizations, the private sector, based on the needs of public administration. Horizontally, we try to help here a bit what you said, member states should not be left alone, and we see a lot of value added from the, let's say, EU level here to foster the exchange with all representatives of member states, both the decision makers, for example, in my case, the ministries of finance, and the implementers, such as tax administrations, yeah? But actually with all public administration and governance. And from all this exchange, we see it's not enough to put a focus on processes, on the right processes, but we need to boost the competencies of decision makers, civil servants, and also researchers to collaborate more effectively together and to reinforce data literacy. Yeah, data literacy, something that we all probably need to learn. So for this purpose, DG Reform has recently, end of last year, established an expert group on public administration and governance. And as one example, for example, to this end, DG Reform will cooperate with member states and line DGs of the Commission, such as JRC or DG RTD, for presenting an overview of European Commission's initiatives in the area of evidence-informed policymaking. Something that you were basically saying, there is a need to consolidate the view and to get going here. So maybe we hope that this will help addressing the wicked and complex problems of policymaking in a more efficient way. Then, and that's actually the core of our job, we help member states with bringing on concrete reform-driven projects, and there is one that we will just start in November this year, a multi-country project with 7 member states, among which also the Czech Republic is a beneficiary, and actually there are many beneficiaries on the administration side in the Czech Republic, such as the Office of the Government of the Czech Republic, the Ministry of Interior, Ministry for Regional Development, Industry, Trade, Science, Research and Innovation, Research, Innovation and Development Council, Technology Agency of the Czech Republic, a lot of players. And the key questions that we are trying to help solve is, what is actually now the situation with engagement of public administrations with scientific evidence, really looking at governance structures, processes, competencies and resources. What are the needs of policymakers and scientists on both sides? And the project will hopefully, provide capacity building, tailored training for scientists and policymakers to be able to see each other better, to understand each other better, and to work more effectively together. So that's more on this horizontal view, and let me give now 2 examples of EUROMOD and how we see the usefulness of EUROMOD here. In short, I mean, we have the opportunity to work with colleagues from JRC to build analytical capacity of ministries of finance, ministries of social security and labor, and independent fiscal councils in Romania, Greece, Slovakia, and Lithuania. And one concrete example, is that we went to Slovakia to help the Slovak Secretariat of the Council for Budget Responsibility to adjust the EUROMOD model to use it with administrative data, for example, including childcare benefits, disability benefits, to have more accuracy of estimation on the effects of tax benefit reforms. So a very pragmatic, very tailored approach, I think, that hopefully will help, in the end, with better budgetary planning also, and also budgetary stability in Slovakia. And a similar exercise, we do with a very tailored approach with the Ministry of Finance in Romania and Lithuanian Ministry of Finance, again, with a strong focus on capacity building and adapting the Euro model to the real data in the countries. And the intention here is also to help the decision makers, well, the technicians, but then in the end, the decision makers, to have a reliable, more consistent tool to assess their policy design, tax policy design, and effects on distributional effects, income inequality, or labor market. So I find these very, very useful experiences and very pragmatic experiences of evidence, bringing evidence into core areas of policy making. So yeah, in short, I mean, very complex and very huge agenda that we are actually talking here about, not to be solved in a year. We hope from DG Reform's perspective to bring some of the evidence here through all the combined expertise, Europe-wide and worldwide actually. I feel EUROMOD is a very good example how this can be done. And I also think, you know, from the workshop that we had yesterday, where we've heard a lot of really very inspiring applications, that there is more exchange that will be beneficial to actually bring the gold standard of policy making into good policy making, that is ex ante evaluations, ex post evaluations, and so forth. So yeah, I'm quite curious of the work ahead, I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will jump directly to our next panelist, whom I will have a very similar question to. So Loukas is the head of the Analysis and Statistics Unit of the European Commission's Director General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. Thank you for coming. So as I said, my question to you will be very similar to one that I just asked Christoph Schwierz. So could you tell us or briefly describe your experience in DG employment, in how you try to encourage and help the member states in doing evidence-based policy making, possibly providing some examples, including EUROMOD. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm happy to be with you and in this fantastic project, which is the EUROMOD, on which we are working since many years now together with Jersey, Eurostat, and from our side, I am from the DG Employment of the Commission, which is, you know, we are dealing with employment and social issues. So EUROMOD is really at the core of it. I mean, it's made for that. So we have been developing it together. And I would like to make reference to the new, the von der Leyen Commission. When she came in, she said, we need to focus on evidence-based policies. And we need to really invest in that. And I think that both the policy, let's say, aspect of it, and is very important. And then now the tool that we have in our hands in order to make it. So, so clearly EUROMOD has become a key instrument for this, for preparing evidence-based policies, and it enhances the capacity of the Commission to assess the policies, and especially ex ante. This is the most important for policymakers. So, in a nutshell, what I want to say is that first, we in the Commission, we actively use it in an extensive way for various instruments. That's one. We make ex ante impact assessments of various policies. I will give you some concrete examples. Second, we use it for forecasting social outcomes together with our colleagues, so to have data, so to be able to monitor social developments early enough, because data from surveys come with a very big lag. And third, we use it for monitoring and for economic analysis. And this is our job in DG Employment, to make economic analysis of all the various policies, and we have public publications, notably our flagship publication, the Employment and Social Developments in Europe annual report. So, and I would also focus on the fact that we count on EUROMOD, and we count on member states to use it as much as possible. We encourage its use, and in that respect, I'm happy, and it's total coincidence, that the Commission yesterday adopted a communication on improving the distributional impact assessments for all policies, and in particular, I mean, who talks about distribution is about the impact of policies in the population in general. More in particular, I would like to first come back to the issue that we in the Commission, we heavily rely on this tool in order to make ex-ante impact evaluations. And the one very good example is the impact evaluation of the fair minimum wage that was adopted earlier this year. So for that, we assessed a number of scenarios of the impact of increase of the statutory minimum wage in the various countries on income and inequality, on poverty, and on the incentives to take up work. So this is a very, very concrete example of what we are doing, and again, this recommendation is already adopted. It was adopted in April, I think. So equally important is that the presentation of the results are increases transparency, as Christoph was saying, and therefore all the policy initiatives gain in public trust, because the more we show clearly what is the initiative and what is the outcome, then, I mean, the public is more convinced about what we are proposing. Now, another very clear example is the initiative on minimum income that is not yet adopted, but is expected to be adopted soon. And there too is the modeling exercise provided insights on the number of households affected, but also on the expected impact of the changes on poverty, inequality, but also on public finances, on employment and labor supply. So this is also a very, very concrete example of an initiative that we have proposed to member states. Now, EUROMOD is also crucial to assess the distributional impacts of legislative proposals which are longer term, not only the immediate ones, but longer term, like the 2030 climate target plan. So much longer perspective, and the strategy on the adaptation of climate change. And there we combine EUROMOD with macro model, so to allow to cover interaction between the economy, the energy system, and the environment, and so to make a joint assessment of both the distributional impacts of the strategy and the macro level interactions. So micro model, macro model combined in order to look at the longer term implications of a certain policy initiative which actually have been adopted. Now, at the same time, the model is used by member states, and we strongly encourage all member states to use it as much as possible for all the policy initiatives ex ante. So to tell, to have an idea already, to use it as a calculator, as Salvador was saying, to show the potential impact of some policy initiative. And in this respect, I come back to what I was saying in the very beginning, that the Commission yesterday adopted this communication on distributional impact assessments in order to encourage member states to use such methods, either with your own model, the national models, because many countries have national models, which sometimes are much more nationally tailored for national purposes, but also to use EUROMOD. And there is a specific section in this communication that is public since yesterday, a special section which recommends strongly EUROMOD as a tool for microeconomic impact assessments. Now, we use EUROMOD also for policy monitoring and analysis. And in this respect, we use it in the framework of the European semester on assessing all the impact of the policy recommendations in the European semester. This might look like the same as the previous one, but is more analytically demanding and concrete to the extent that we have to check each time a member state proposes an initiative, what would it mean for them? So it's also from outside. So it covers budgetary, economic, including initiative for work, for taking up work, and also social impacts, of course. Now, we use it also for our annual ESDA report, as I was saying earlier on. The latest annual employment and social developments in Europe report was on youth. And there we had the full section using EUROMOD in order to analyze the impact of tax benefit systems on young people's market income following the pandemic. But also in our previous reports, we have used it in several occasions. I will not go into detail. Now, we use it also for monitoring poverty and inequality. And as we have an issue with data lags, so together with our JRC colleagues and Eurostat, we produce what we call, Eurostat produces flash estimates, which is a kind of nowcasting, it's a kind of, let's say, reducing the lag based on some assumptions. So this is something which is very important for policymakers because we have an idea of what was the impact on poverty and inequality over the most recent period. So policymakers would like to see what happened recently. For the future, we are fully keen into expanding the model, into using increasingly the model for all kinds of initiatives, and to expand the model. And one specific example of expanding the model is a new tool that we want to introduce. Is the hypothetical household tool, which is very close to our heart because it will expand our analytical possibilities, not only for one specific given household type, but more household types. So it can be more, we can make more tailored, let's say, analysis on specific policy questions. So, to conclude, we are committed to further promote the model, the use of the model, both in-house in the Commission, but with the Member States. And we are committed to promote the model and its expansion to use it in more cases, so to elaborate it more, so to use it in, to be more concrete in the uses that we may have out of it. Now it's all clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is very interesting. So it seems that the data is there, the model is there, and still, you know, the situation is not so optimistic. So I will kind of end the round trick around our panelists with a Czech person here. So Šimon Vydra is the head of the section for legislative analysis, which is the first and currently the only section of the newly created government analytical unit, which is part of the office of the government. So let me just give you like a brief background. So our government that was appointed at the end of the last year has a very ambitious goals in its program regarding the improvement of policy making process in the Czech Republic. They aim to introduce much more of evidence-based policies, right? And while we are in the situation where we really like behind in the Czech Republic. So I would ask you, Šimon, to tell us a little bit more about this new government analytical unit, to tell us a little bit more about what you are trying to establish there, and also, so not only what you have already done, but what are the plans for the future? Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's a very apt introduction. The current priorities of the government are quite ambitious in this respect. Some of them are quite specific. They have to do with specific reforms of certain laws. I won't really go into that right now, but for us as members of the Ministry of Legislation, there are two primary points that are relevant for us. And they both have to do with essentially producing better regulation. And one of them is about ex-ante analysis, and one of them is about ex-post analysis, with the ambition of improving the quality and the use of both of these, and specifically for ex-post, so that it happens within 5 years of a new law being enacted. A third point, or a third agenda point on this, is the establishment of us, so the Government Analytical Unit, and we are in some ways a solution to some of the problems within those two priorities. So I'll quickly talk about the problems, and then I'll quickly talk about how we aim or how we already do solve them. So the issue with ex-ante analysis, or the good news with it, let's start with the good news, is that there already is a system for this. So Czech Republic has a regulatory impact assessment board, which oversees the regulatory impact assessment procedure every year as a part of the plan for legislative tasks. You can read that as what each ministry has to submit throughout the year. There is a designation for which tasks require regulatory impact assessment. Then those tasks have to come with an actual regulatory impact assessment, and the board evaluates whether that impact assessment is sufficient, both methodologically and in its scope. The issue with that is that often this is, in the process, considered as an afterthought. So you create the law that you would like to have, and only after that you kind of find out, or you consider, oh, we have to do this paperwork, which is the impact assessment, so then you tailor your impact assessment to the law that you already think is the best possible law. Now the RIA board, of course, has the authority to say, okay, that's bad, you should rework your regulatory impact assessment. So there is this, to use the age-old metaphor of carrots and sticks, there is this stick that you can get essentially told off for your regulatory impact assessment not meeting the quality standards. However, due to time pressure and political pressure, even if you have to rework what you have done, this is unlikely to result in a substantive change to the law itself. So it can result in a change to the report, to your regulatory impact assessment, but that won't translate itself to the law. So in a way, it is evidence-based policymaking that happens backwards. So we're getting evidence for the policy that we have. This is, of course, doesn't happen all the time, but this is the issue that has been identified. Now, how we aim to solve this issue, or what our task is to supplement this stick with also a carrot. So we as unit aim to have, and already do have to some extent, our own analytical capabilities. and we engage with ministries that prepare a regulatory impact assessment, and we aim to make this process kind of more alive and to happen throughout the entire process of drafting this law. So we are there from the start, from sort of first stakeholder meetings, all the way to the final report being submitted. We do this in two flavors currently. So we either provide a sort of holistic assistance where some of us will be part of all the meetings effectively and provide some sort of analytical expertise. So we're not there to provide the domain-specific knowledge. For that, the relevant ministries have the expertise, but we are there to help them translate this knowledge into methodology that is strong enough for the RIA board to accept, and eventually also to a better law at the end of the day. Of course, we can't force ministries to do this with us, so we also offer, let's say, more tailor-made solutions, where instead of outsourcing a very specific part of your analytical process, let's say some model to give you some specific insight, we will do that for you with appropriate consultation, so you don't have to get it done by an outside company for profit and with often insufficient consultation. So there is our role with respect to ex-ante analysis. We're providing the other side of the coin, so there isn't just the stick that kind of tells you off at a point when it's far too late to actually make a change, but that we are there to help ministries really get the data and the insights when they can use them. Then when it comes to ex-post analysis, the good news there is also something that exists, that is the responsibility on ministries to carry out ex-post analysis. They do specify this responsibility for themselves when they submit the original regulatory impact assessment, which includes the information about how you will re-evaluate this policy and when. The issue here is that the RIA board doesn't assess these reports, so the responsibility exists, but it's not really overseen in a meaningful way so far. One way to put this, which is a Czech metaphor that often goes around when talking about this, is that it's analysis that's tailor-made for the filing cabinet. So you make it, and immediately upon making it, it gets filed away and again doesn't get scrutinized and doesn't inform the policy moving forward. On this, we haven't made very specific steps yet, because in the legislative process there is now a law, it's in sort of open consultations between various ministries that would allow RIA board to have access or to have a say on whether these ex-post evaluations are done sufficiently and correctly. And for that, we're currently building up the capacity. So ministries that we are working with now, we take this into account. We try to set up sort of data collection procedures so that when it's time, they know how to evaluate this. And we're also developing the necessary analytical capabilities to do this together with the RIA board once this process can be established.
Thank you very much. So this was very detailed. Thank you very much for this. This brings us basically to the second part of our event, where our panelists should be able to discuss more freely between themselves and also opens kind of the room for the audience. I will start sticking to the Czech case for a little bit. So my question is, so we heard that we really are in a good place, starting in a situation where we really don't have many capacities at the ministries. We don't have many people who would trust in evidence-based policy making, right? And we try to push them to use it, right? And if we do, we end up doing what you mentioned, that they provide the evidence after they decided what they want to do. Would you have any insights about how to improve that? How to make the policymakers more trustworthy towards this project, this process of evidence-based policymaking? How to make the media more interested in that? How to make voters more interested in how the policymaking is done? And I kind of open this question for anyone who would like to answer it.
Yeah, thank you. So I will go back to the points I was discussing earlier, unsurprisingly, but I think if the Ministry of Interior, together with the other co-sponsors of the future bill, manages to introduce legislation that would allow for access, merging, and anonymized use of individual-level public data, that would be one answer to your question. Because at least in academia, where we have fields of social science present in the country, people would write dissertations and papers, and they would then indirectly, perhaps, create the pressure on public administration to generate those types of evaluations, especially the ex post evaluations, where we're still struggling for just acceptance of the concept and of the methodology which has been used for decades. And where data access, of course, being an obvious thing for decades in many, old member states. The other answer, and this is a point where I need to thank, DG reform, and there are other instruments, not just the TSI, there's PSF and so on, but sometimes technical support can be invaluable. I'm sure it's always invaluable, but it's particularly invaluable where the local analytical capacity is lacking, right? So you can actually show how things are done, that they can be done. And then ideally, I think these projects should generate the local longer-term analytical capacity, because with all of these fields of applied research and all of the types of questions that you get, you just cannot cover every field fully. That's just that. We're going back to the staggering number of 1,400 projects. And so, and the third, to my view, a missing part of the answer is that it is very often difficult to build new fields of science and applied research in these countries because it seems to be nobody's responsibility. Many of these countries don't have very specific discipline policy, R&D policy, right? Directed towards making sure that in important fields of science, there's a minimum research capacity and quality present in every member state. Well, the Commission isn't doing that. I've believed that most member states that I'm familiar with don't do that. And the academic institutions are, after all, very often labor-managed companies that represent what they're already doing well, which might be natural science or other fields. So that's the third element that I don't see being covered by any policy instrument right now, because we cannot rely on technical support instrument to generate all the capacity. That's just not going to be feasible.
Thank you. So maybe if I may just ask Šimon, do you know whether there are any initiatives, here in the Czech Republic that would push towards getting administrative data ready for research purposes, which was the first point that Štěpán Jurajda made?
Yes. So we're still a young unit, but the one project that we're working on is together with NAKIT, which is a state company providing IT services, and they have the ambition of creating a shareable repository of data from public institutions, both kind of on demand if we initiate the input, but also once we initiate the input, so the data stays there for future use by either us or other analytical teams from other ministries. It's quite a young initiative. It's now in the pilot phase. So they are trying to put a few specific data sets for us, or make them available for us, I should say. That's the initiative that I'm most aware of right now.
And is there any way that we could match these data together also? Because very often these administrative data, they focus on a specific area, right? And they don't give you much information about other things, which is a big disadvantage compared to some survey data, for example. So is there any way we can think about having them merged together?
Well, that's unfortunately tremendously difficult. So this platform, at this point at least, is not particularly open to having that level of data. This also has to do with sort of data protection regulation and so on. So the matching there is extremely difficult because the data, so that it is shareable by other governmental institutions, can't really be disaggregated to the point where we could do this reliably. So that it indeed is a big challenge.
Okay, thanks. And I think Christoph wanted to react before.
Yes, thank you. Just wanted to put a thought from my experience on reforms that I have been, let's say, accompanying or witnessing in the Czech Republic, but also in other member states. What I sometimes feel and see is, you know, that you have a team in public administration that is asked to deliver. But then they are actually not empowered to do so. So you have a small team that basically has, you know, all the willingness and the encouragement to deliver, or, for example, on health system reforms, bringing in-health and e-health into reality. But then the resources are not there. There are changing, of course, political circumstances. So sometimes, you know, governments have to make the difficult choices of, do we push for more own resources and enable our own administration, means maybe a bit more hiring, a bit more on the payroll, or do we always have to rely on other external sources? And on the other hand, I do see, if the kind of good conditions are there, you can have a small team of people that can do wonders, you know, that can do wonders. If it's a clear mandate, if there is a budgetary resources for that, and some stability that these people will be left for doing their work, which always takes a bit more than the political cycle, then a lot can be done. So I think we have the ingredients, but the choices are often difficult politically to do.
So maybe let me just follow up on that. So do you have some best practice, you know, examples from some member states that like managed, that were maybe in the situation of the Czech Republic before, but they managed to introduce this evidence-based policymaking into the policymaking decision process, and whether you think that creating this analytical unit that kind of has all the has to do all the work is the way to go, or do we really need to have those people or these capacities at the ministries themselves and everywhere in the government?
I haven't done that analysis, I have to say, and to my experience, you know, the situation is too heterogeneous. I mean, because a lot of the cultural aspect is very, very important. I was just very recently in a meeting between two different administrations, one from a northern member state and one from a southern member state, and you could basically see how this small team from the northern member state, you know, was empowered and was used to a transparency in working on data, enabling people, you know, to work in a very, very open mode based on own initiative, which was very, very strange to the other administration. So I don't think there is a best practice, but I think we have the ingredients already on paper and sometimes even in practice. And one of those ingredients is, for me, to give the teams, such as, for example, in your case, you know, the assurance, the independence, the mandate to be able to survive a political cycle and to be independent also out of political influences over a period of 4, 5, 6, 7 years. These problems need time, and people who work on these problems need to have the assurance that they can do their job for many years to solve this. So just one idea out of my experience, yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe to give an example and link concretely with fiscal policy making in Europe. I mean, it's well known that, there is ample evidence that in countries where you have an independent, a truly independent watchdog, fiscal watchdog, so an institution that make an assessment of a fiscal proposal, in those policies, usually fiscal policy is working better, meaning that deficits are more under control and that things are working, let's say, in a proper way or in an expected way in terms of fiscal policy making. The independence of the research side fiscal watchdog in this case. Independent fiscal institution is key. I think that also what is worth stressing is that the responsibility of the scientific community is key. And there, I mean, we are coming from long way. I mean, there was no such tradition. Impact assessment done now at national levels on a systematic basis. The Commission has made huge progress there as well. The proof that EUROMOD now is with us in the Commission is intensively used and extensively used for many policy assessment is a proof of success and the way forward as well. But I think the responsibility of the scientific community is there as well, and we should underline that. The scientific community at large should focus on issues which are relevant for society and should communicate those issues and should be able to communicate their own independent assessment, and the policymakers should hear this. So there is, I think Christoph mentioned, a cultural issue which exists in some countries. I took the example of the assessment of fiscal plans. It's clear that some countries are doing much better than others, and it's clear also that those countries in general, in those countries things are working better. There is a better empowerment also of the policy choice which are made. There was a tradition until recently, for instance in the Netherlands, to have an independent assessment by the Central Planning Bureau of all the program of the different parties running for general election, where they will make an assessment, an independent assessment of the fiscal consequences, but also the redistributive consequences of those choices. This type of thing should be systematically done across EU countries. We are not yet there, but I think having EUROMOD and other microsimulation model to focus on the very specific case of fiscal policy, but there are other areas, and making those assessments public and educating the people to let's say, to use those tools and to have access to those tools in order to better understand the consequences of alternative policy choice is really something we should promote, and that's what we are indirectly or directly working at different levels. These are clear examples, focusing on the fiscal side, but I think there are clearly best practices that can be identified, and we should promote the diffusion of those best practices.
It's interesting when you talk about, the scientific community and how they could and should contribute to this. So do you think they should be somehow incentivized to do so, that we should kind of put more money into policy applied research, or how would you do that?
Well, we have a clear issue in Europe, specifically in some countries, of underfinancing research. I mean, this is something which is clearly there, and we can only repeat that. I mean, science is key for better understanding society now, but better understanding the challenges of the future. But I think the cultural thing, which is no guarantee, I can think of a country where research is outstanding, at the best institution in the world, where there's a clear research culture, and still the policymakers are not necessarily doing the best policies. And now I think we have recent evidence on that. I won't give names. So it's no guarantee, but it creates the condition for the public debate. I think this is something which is essential. We should educate the people. We should have the scientists understand that what they do can have a concrete impact on improving society at different level, but also we should improve the general understanding of the power and the usefulness of science, independent science, to support policy.
Thanks. So I have another question for Loukas. So you mentioned that we should kind of encourage member states to use EUROMOD, right? But how do we do that when they often lack these capacities, right? Especially at the ministries, at this level, when the decision-making process is being made, they basically lack capacities to do that. So do you have some specific plan about how to do this? Maybe specifically concerning the EUROMOD, but maybe in general using tools like that, or doing analysis with the data?
Well, I don't have any specific program, let's say, or plan to unveil today, if this is what you mean. But of course, we have to follow a stick and carrot approach as usual, and try to find to give the opportunity to us and to member states to use this tool. So, making available such a tool, I think, is already something very important. Salvador was referring to the Netherlands and to the assessment of budgetary initiatives before the election. I mean, this is a very, very simple and clear example, of course, for budgetary policies, but I mean, this is mandatory for them, you know? So, so it's very clear that they have to do it, otherwise they cannot present an initiative publicly. So, so yeah, from our side, except what Christoph was saying about you know, how to promote reforms and all this explanations that he gave to us, from our side, we try to put together member states, the scientific community, and the statistical community to put resources together and making the tools publicly available and free. So and this is why I use the word encourage. I mean, we don't have any specific financial instrument to support it, but we encourage everybody to use it ex ante. I think this is very, very important, you know, to assess before adopting any policy initiative to see what is the impact of this initiative. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So we don't use, I think, EUROMOD very often, right? So do you plan to use it in your in your new analytical unit?
That's a very direct question. Yes, we do, but we haven't yet. So the issue, again, we're quite a young unit. This is our fifth legislation we're working on, and none of them were in an area where we would. So we do kind of keep a running list of models of interest, whether they're sort of national or European, but we unfortunately lack the capacity to kind of investigate them prior to really needing them. So we're waiting on a good use case, and then for each use case at the start, we kind of look at what are, the useful analytical tools, but also the analytical tools that are feasible for us to use in the kind of time frame that we have. From my limited understanding of EUROMOD, I believe it would be feasible to use in the time frame that we would have, but we just haven't run into a use case for it yet.
Thanks a lot. So I think it might be time to, go for questions from the audience. We unfortunately don't have microphones for the audience, so maybe you can try to shout the question, and then maybe I will repeat it so that everyone can hear it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this interesting discussion. Michael Fuchs from the European Center for Social Welfare Policy and Research in Vienna. I just wanted to refer to this Austrian example, which would provide some incentives for public authorities to use tools like EUROMOD and microdata much more often. So in Austria, I don't know when it was exactly 5 years ago or so, a law was implemented so that the public administrations, they are obliged to also check the social outcome of a reform if it affects more than 160,000 people. And with this law, we as the European Center were contracted also to create an online tool for microstimulation, which is based on EUROMOD called Survey, so it's still in place, it's still funded. And also I think this law, although I'm not 100% sure if it's really used every time, more than 160 people would be affected by reform, but at least we have this law, and so somehow at least it's brought some incentives to combine some potential policy reforms more with analysis tools and this record data. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very nice example. So it seems that to some extent we really do need the law first, and then we have to find a way to oblige to it. Are there any more questions?
Many thanks for the discussion. We're talking about data, so my question regards administrative data. We all acknowledge how useful this kind of data is, and we are often told to use it, but the issue is that they come under very, very hard restrictions, access restrictions. So my question is, what can we do, what you think we can do to somehow improve and facilitate access to this kind of data?
Any volunteers for this very difficult question?
I can start.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think the situation is very different from one country to another in terms of access to administrative data. And there was reference in the Nordic countries, it's quite easy. And because the legislation is in place and all the privacy issues have been solved, so they can easily match administrative data at micro level, and it's there. Sometimes, even in these countries, there's a problem of timeliness with administrative data. We know that for surveys we have a time lag, and this is why you were referring to the fact that we need to have flash estimates or something, but in some countries, administrative data, it's even worse. And so we are obliged to use the administrative data even 1 year before for that. But in some countries, it's working, and I think we see in some of us progress being made over time. They have adjusted the national legislations to allow for using administrative data. And I can tell you, from the launching of Silk 20 years ago to now, we see a lot of changes. And Silk is a survey, but in fact it's not entirely a survey, because in a lot of countries, all the income information comes from administrative data. So it's replaced by administrative data, or it's used for validating the data. But it remains difficult in a group of countries, I think including Czechia. And for that, I don't have a solution, but I think from the experience of some countries, you see that it's linked to, it has to do with laws and privacy issues and so on. And if you don't solve this issue at that level, it will be very difficult to move. But it's not as negative as that. In the EU, there's some countries where it's working perfectly well. And we know one of the countries, they are an example, but from the beginning it has been conceived, and with each individual with an identification number, and allowing them to link people through all registers and so on. But, okay, difficult question.
Thank you. I think Christoph wanted to add something.
Yeah, just to share a thought of that, I think maybe one puzzle of the answer may be to learn from other disciplines. Yeah, for example, I learned to know that if you look into genetic research, there are a lot of local, regional networks which use genetic data, which is of course highly sensitive, right? But there are ways, to basically use the data that is generated in Germany in Spain without moving the data, but running your progress and so on and so on. So I think exchanging more on interdisciplinary ways, seeing some are more advanced than others, that can help to find the right solution.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for a very good question, because actually data are extremely important for making this kind of analysis. Unfortunately, as Anne and Christoph were saying, there is a big heterogeneity among member states, and our job is actually to try to make it, to reduce it actually. And I just wanted to mention that the communication that was adopted yesterday, there are 2 points here. Member states are encouraged to combine survey data and administrative data when doing DIAs, and to make administrative data more readily available for both public bodies and researchers. So it's exactly that. Of course, this is not a recommendation. This is an encouragement. From outside, also, I would like to say that we, as Commission, as DG Employment, we are actively working on that. We have a project with outside stakeholders, including the OECD, and we have projects on the use of administrative data for specific purposes in specific countries. Our wish is to generalize it as much as possible, but okay, this is an uphill task. Thank you.
Thanks. Are there any other questions? Go ahead, Daniel.
Daniel Milik from think idea at CERGE-EI at home today. I will start my question by 3 remarks. First is that I was very happy hearing that there is first Czech institution using EUROMOD. It's National Fiscal Council, and we have I think 1 or 2 representatives here in the hall, so it's great. It's not by chance that the people there who work with the model 1 or 2 are students of Clara at Prague School of Economics, where she's teaching, I don't know how it's called. It's
policy evaluation.
Stuff like that. Second, Shimon, we discussed before we started here that you have rather specific education which can be hardly or is impossible to get here. You studied in the Netherlands, right? Fields which are quite important. I don't want to debate in detail. And Štěpán mentioned that concerning anti-COVID fight, in number of fields there were no experts at all, or few he could count in the whole country. So this brings me to the question. We are here after the Velvet Revolution 30 years. It's quite a long time, 3 decades. How many? Almost 20 years in EU, right? And still, we are in a situation where, okay, we understand data problem, but will we wait another 20, 30 years to get human capital in economic terms, or human resources, or expertise in our way? Shouldn't there be more active program? Because we need experts in every country. It doesn't work that Christopher will do it instead of our experts, simply. We have to have experts in all these fields which are related to policy. So my question is, should there be some active step down, big bang, or will we wait another 20, 30 years?
Another difficult question. So you will not let me answer it, right?
It's a rhetorical question.
I think if I may shed an optimistic light on this, I mean, there have been progress. I'm thinking, for instance, in terms of access to the data and let's say interaction between the scientific academic part and the policy part. I mean, I'm thinking of the case of France, for instance, a country which didn't have a strong tradition of being transparent in terms of making the data available and so on. And there have been huge progress made recently, precisely because you had a very active, specific academic group that was pushing, but that was directly connected with some, let's call them educated policymakers, and it takes a bit of a lot of enthusiasm and courage to really push things forward in terms of accessing administrative data. The situation is improving. I mean, traditionally in the fiscal area, you have many studies using Norwegian data, Swedish data, which are extremely interesting, but maybe not telling for the country. So I think we are making significant progress. And I will not, I think the Big Bang is more, let's say it's not a Big Bang, it's a progressive bang, right? Which is maybe happening. And what I think we need to really do is to work towards educating the people, educating the policymakers, which is a huge task. But that's something we should work, because it's important for policymakers in particular to understand the benefit they can get from, let's say, sound science and robust science supporting their policy choices. And I think there is ample scope for improving things, but we've made some progress. In particular, some countries where the tradition was not necessarily there have made spectacular progress in that respect.
Thank you for, bringing some optimism into that. Are there any more questions?
André de Koster from Leuven. So I want to pick up on that because for the second time, Salvador refers to educating the people also. So I have a question on, maybe it's for this afternoon, about strategic decisions about the development of EUROMOD. But, so you already made it public through that interface, and I hear from the panel here, certainly from the EUROMOD involved people and from the Commission, that they really want to foster the use of EUROMOD by, and if I heard it precisely, it's mainly directed to policymakers in the member state countries. But my question is, certainly as far as the development of EUROMOD is concerned, isn't there not a tension, or at least a trade-off to be made in the resources, how they are spent, in making this model, or develop the model further, in making it available for the public at large, which I'm on the side also that this is an important ambition for Europe, and on the other hand, for the policymakers in the member state countries. So my impression, or my experience a little bit in Belgium is also that if you develop EUROMOD like it has been done up to now, the last 25 years, going ahead always with all the countries in EUROMOD on board, that then it's not detailed enough for the policymakers. If they want to use it, like now for the energy crisis measures, I think also certainly for COVID, because health issues are very specific, that the model is not detailed enough at the national level. That's what I always hear if we promote it, also because it's mostly not relying on the administrative data yet, but it's also the modeling issues themselves. Whereas for the public at large, for educating the people, like you suggested, calculating the electoral platforms in electoral times, like in the Netherlands, then the model is far too complicated, and you don't need all these comparisons with other countries. Then you need very, very, very simplified models for the public at large, also for students, I think, even. That's also visible now in the courses that you have to give for EUROMOD, for people starting to work with EUROMOD. Well, it takes 1.5, 2 days. This is a very, very high threshold before you can enter using the model, in fact. So my question is, don't you have two target groups of users on which you have to think very carefully how you will make the decisions to develop the model further, if you want to target them both, or to continue to target them both, or for the panel then, or for the people from the Commission, is there one specific group which has more weight than the other, and it is then, I guess, the national administrations and policymakers?
Thank you. So, Salvador?
Yes, the question is more or less addressed to me. A direct answer is that the EUROMOD interface now is available to anyone who requests it. So anyone can request it. Of course, we have limited capacity, and we have to make an assessment and not to filter, but to make sure that the requests are sound. Now, we have limited resources. We cannot have infinite resources. There is a trade-off between, it's true, between complexity of the model and what can be done in concrete terms. We would like to represent fully the tax and social benefit system of all countries. That's the ideal world, but maybe things are too complicated to be used. But if you want the model to be useful, I would say to improve its usefulness and its realism, I think the data plays a key role. I mean, you can simulate any policies as long as you have the information that you need to simulate those policies. So having access to administrative data, if I may add a bit of pressure to policymakers, is a key issue. Now, having said this, I think it's a matter of, and I insist on educating people, but there the role of intermediary bodies is key. I mean, if I think of journalists, for instance, the way they treat, when you make an interview, for instance, when we get a request in the commission for an interview from a journalist, everybody gets frightened. I mean, you have to go through so many filters. And why is that? Because there is, we know that there is a tendency to distort answer, to a bit manipulate towards certain orientation, can be political, ideological, or whatever. I think the role played by intermediate bodies, and I'm thinking of journalists, is very important. The more educated they are, the better to play their role as an interface between the scientific, the policy part, and the general public. That will be something which will prove useful concretely in the case of EUROMOD, for instance. If we had a few journalists, economic journalists specialized on tax fiscal policy issues that would use EUROMOD, for instance, and that would make an assessment when you have a big reform in a given country using EUROMOD or whatever. It doesn't need to be EUROMOD. Well, if it's EUROMOD, it's better, it's good for us, but there are other approaches, and we know that. If journalists, for instance, could make a systematic use of and base their analysis on model-based or good data, that would be a big change. And I think we are far from that. I mean, there are countries where you have this, I mean, but it's not systematic. And that would be a concrete way of improving things. So, of course, the web interface is very nice and potentially accessible to everyone, but it's not usable by anyone because you need a bit of education, as you say, and training. If I answer to your question. It's a complex question, but I think we still have room for discussion. Thanks.
Any more questions?
With your conclusion, I have a very straightforward question to Šimon. You mentioned the regulatory impact assessment. I was just wondering, is there also distributional analysis in it? Because you mentioned that you've never used your models or using some other models, or if it's not being done now, will there be some distributional considerations in the future?
Okay, thank you for that question. So here I'll answer it structurally. So from our perspective, if we are in a position as the analytical unit to do that type of analysis, that will be one of the primary things we will look at. That doesn't mean that that's currently done, so that's the big distinction. For us, it would be one of the big impacts to look at. However, we don't always get the chance to kind of work through the entire legislation, and not all ministries always consider that as either an important impact, or the argumentation that's provided in the final RIA report is that it won't have a significant impact on distributional outcomes. That's, of course, this isn't always the case, so you will find RIA reports that do go into distributional outcomes. I have not done the analysis to look at how many of them specifically do it, and they should. But it is something that exists. It is part of the methodology to do it. But if you argue that there aren't important distributional outcomes, and nobody kind of calls you out on that argument, either the RIA board or somebody else, then they won't be present in that particular case. I hope that answers the question.
So maybe one last question from the audience? Or maybe we want to go for lunch. Oh, yeah, okay, Daniel.
I hope so. I have two questions. In fact, I want to bring back a question asked by Štěpán. He asked, and I'm not sure whether I heard the answer. He asked whether the Commission expects some review, survey of evidence impact policies used across member states. And Christopher, you mentioned something going on, something being prepared, but can we expect that after a year or two we will have comprehensive survey of how Czechs do not do?
Yes, this is not something that I am running in DG Reform, but certainly I think this is one of the expected outcomes. So bringing together all of the tools and the evidence that we use in the European Commission, I think something that probably my colleagues who came up with these initiatives, as I'm not the one managing this one, is, you know, that I face somewhere else, where basically I see the ministries, they see all the instruments that are employed in the European Commission. There are many, okay? It's very difficult to understand when to use which for which purpose at best. Bringing this together and providing a service to the member states, really a real service. Okay, if they come with a question, which tool should I use? This kind of central service, this could be an answer to the question, rather than leaving member states a bit on their own, you know, and then replicating the capacities at each member state level. So then, if that goes into this way, I do hope, the Czech Republic probably will not need to build all the capacities, but will hopefully also be able to benefit, you know, from a more central hub that can do this role. Yeah. If I may, I have actually one question that is in my head, having the occasion, having Štěpán here. I was just wondering, with the double hat that you have on, having been a researcher for so long and now policymaker, how do you convince the policymaker in yourself to use the evidence that the researcher in yourself gives you? Thank you.
Well, that's an easy one, right? I'm already converted. The issue is that the total budget for R&D is no longer increasing in this country for obvious reasons. That's not a surprise to anybody. And the system, as in many countries, has many stakeholders. So, you know, my best guess is the country is currently spending about 100 times more on specific applied research in agriculture, on potatoes and crops, and than it does on the new RIA unit. So I've been educating doctoral students since 1997 in labor economics in this country. Not one of them has so far been employed in public service to run any of those analyses. So, you know, we'll see. Coming back to Daniel's question, how much longer will it take? My big worry is that we don't have a lot of time left before large other social crises are upon us, where expertise will be needed in every country with aging. And so, you know, that's the challenge we've been discussing today.
Okay, ending on a positive note. Okay, I would like to thank our panelists for coming, joining, and discussing today with us. Thank you for the audience as well. Thank you for the great event, and I think we need a big applause for that.